It is time to panic about these 7 players in fantasy football. I'm Matty Kiwoom from South Harmon Fantasy Football. Let's get into it. People, it is absolutely time to push that panic button on the Steelers wide receiver George Pickens. So far in 2024, he has 44 targets for 26 catches, 363 receiving yards, a big goose egg, 0 touchdowns so far this year, a 9.9 fantasy points per game. That's wide receiver 47 so far this season. Let's check out his WARP, shall we? 0.356 wins over replacement. That's good as wide receiver 37, the 82nd most valuable player so far in fantasy football. Now, the volume and the quality of the targets, they're pretty good. A 29% target share is a good number. A 42.1% air yard share is definitely encouraging. He also has 6 red zone targets. That's 11th most so far this season. So why am I panicking on the menace George Pickens? Well, first and foremost, the Steelers are not throwing the ball enough. And Pickens, well, quite simply, he just hasn't been efficient in the lack of targets and the lack of volume to produce on a high level for fantasy football. The Steelers have a 47.1% passing play percentage. That's the second lowest in the NFL. Not good when you want your pass catchers getting the volume that we want in fantasy football. And on top of it, the Steelers are only throwing for 166.8 passing yards per game. That is the 5th lowest so far in the NFL. And we're talking about George Pickens' lack of efficiencies. Well, a 1.42 fantasy points per target. That mark is 72nd amongst qualified wide receivers. It is time, folks. We got to panic about George Pickens. Folks, it is absolutely time to start panicking about Buccaneers running back Rachaad White in fantasy football. So far this season, he has 51 carries for 187 rushing yards. He's also added 17 catches for 127 yards, but he has yet to find pay dirt. That's right, 0 tutties for White this season. His 9.7 fantasy points per game makes him running back 34 at this point in the season. 2.61 WARP, that's running back 33 and 104th overall in fantasy football. Now, Rachaad White, there's no question about it. He's still a weapon in the passing game. 3.4 receptions per game, a 12.5% target share, which is 9th amongst qualified running backs, and a 71.2% route participation rate. That's the 2nd highest in football, but it is still time to panic about Rachaad White because, quite frankly, and I don't want to sugarcoat this, it's tough to hear, but after what we saw last week, you can make the argument that Rachaad White is the 3rd best runner on this team. Rachaad White is 60th in true yards per carry, 23rd so far this season in juke rate, and 94th in EPA. Now, it's tough to see any of those numbers truly improving, especially with White dealing with that foot injury that kept him out last week. And if he misses more games going forward, well, that's going to leave the door open for Sean Tucker and rookie Bucky Irving to take the role and run with it. Folks, it's time to panic about Rachaad. We've all kind of been panicking about this player, but now it's time to make it official like a referee with a whistle. And folks, it's time to hit that panic button on Travis Etienne, running back from the Jacksonville Jaguars. He has 56 rushing attempts for 230 rushing yards. He has 16 receptions for 91 receiving yards. He has found pay dirt twice, but that 9.7 fantasy points per game is only good enough to be running back 34. We drafted him to perform a hell of a lot higher than running back 34. 2.86 wins over replacement. That number makes him running back 29. Also, 98th overall. He's almost outside of the top 100 when we're talking about value in fantasy football. And is really just a lot to panic about, but what really makes me want to panic is there are no true positive indicators in his analytical profile, and his backup, Hank Bigsby, continues to outplay him. Etienne is 25th so far this season in yards created, 49th in fantasy points per opportunity, 43rd in yards per touch. Meanwhile, Hank Bigsby is 3rd in true yards per carry, 1st in juke rate, and 1st in yards created per touch amongst qualified running backs. That is a player that is deserving, that is earning more opportunities, and that is not good for Travis Etienne. And then when you sprinkle on top of it all, the fact that Etienne's dealing with multiple injuries, a Wally Pipp situation is possible in Jacksonville. And folks, it's easy to see it, and I'm going to say it. It's time to panic about Travis Etienne. Anthony Richardson came into the season with a lot of hype, but folks, it is time to panic about the quarterback from the Indianapolis Colts. So far this season, he has 654 passing yards, a 50.7 completion percentage. He has added 141 rushing yards and 4 total touchdowns, but the 13.1 fantasy points per game, well, that's QB 25 at this point in the season. And when you look at his WARP, 1.64, it's a little bit better than QB 25, but not much. QB 16. And in our 1 QB seasonal leagues, he's outside of the top 100 in terms of the most valuable players in fantasy. He falls at 125th. It's easy to panic. The reasons are there. It's pretty clear, but despite the injuries, despite the lack of true production from the second-year quarterback, the real reason to set the alarms, to start panicking about A-Rich is simply Joe Flacco is giving the Indianapolis Colts a better chance to win. And when you dive into the analytical profile of Anthony Richardson, there's not a whole lot there, folks, to be excited about. A 57.4% true completion percentage is 35th in the NFL. He's 27th in adjusted yards per attempt. And he also has the 9th most danger plays this season, and that's despite missing multiple games. You can see a situation where Chris Ballard and Shane Steichen want to preserve their jobs, get wins, maybe make the playoffs. Right now, the Colts are 3-3. They're knocking on the door for a playoff berth, and quite frankly, Joe Flacco gives them a better chance to win this season, and that is exactly why I have to hit the panic button on Anthony Richardson. Speaking of players from the AFC South, I am absolutely panicking, and you should too, in regards to the Tennessee Titans wide receivers. That's both DeAndre Hopkins and Calvin Ridley. Now, these two wide receivers, here are their combined numbers at this point in the season. 47 targets, 23 receptions, 316 receiving yards, just 2 touchdowns. Remember, those numbers are Calvin Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins numbers combined. Not good. Not good at all. Now, looking at just DeAndre Hopkins, 7.5 fantasy points per contest. That's wide receiver 70. Yuck. Gross. And his 0.44 WARP is even more disgusting. He is the 150th overall player in terms of value right now in fantasy football. And his teammate Calvin Ridley isn't seeing a whole lot more. He isn't doing that much better at this point in the young season. Well, I guess it's really not so young anymore. But anyway, Calvin Ridley, 7.6 fantasy points per game. That's wide receiver 69. Nice. A little bit better, but by 1 spot for DeAndre Hopkins, so not good. He does have a little bit better WARP. He's a little bit more valuable in fantasy, but not a lot. 1.76, that's good for wide receiver 54 and 122nd overall. And when you look at the Tennessee Titans and their passing attack, it's easy to panic about both of these guys. The Titans are just not throwing the ball that much. And Will Levis, despite what I thought he could be, well, he's been comically bad this year. And truthfully, there is no one coming to save these two wide receivers. The Tennessee Titans have 135 passing yards per game. That's one of the worst marks in the NFL. And they have a minus 0.46 EPA per pass. That's dead last, people, in the NFL. And when you look at the depth chart, Mason Rudolph, he's the backup quarterback. He is not the type of guy that's going to come in and save these two wide receivers. And that is exactly why both Calvin Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins are absolutely worth panicking about. Trade D-Hop. Things started off pretty good for this guy, but as of right now, I am absolutely panicking in my boots for the running back for the Cincinnati Bengals, Zack Moss. So far in the season, he has 63 carries for 224 yards. He's added 16 receptions for 126 receiving yards. He does have 3 total touchdowns. And when you look at his fantasy points per game, 11.2, it's good for running back 30. He has been pretty valuable at the running back position so far, according to his WARP, 378. That's running back 25, 73rd overall. But why am I panicking about a guy who has had multiple running back 2 weeks? Well, when you look at his analytical profile, it strongly suggests that Moss was merely a volume play for fantasy football, and he is quickly losing opportunities to his teammate, Chase Brown. Over the last 2 games, Zack Moss has less than 5 fantasy points per game. And when you look at Chase Brown's true yards per carry, his juke rate, his breakaway run rate, and his fantasy points per opportunity, all of those metrics are a lot better, way better than Zack Moss. So Zack Moss is going down, Chase Brown's going up, and that is exactly why I am panicking about Zack Moss. Without a doubt, you have to be panicking about these players in fantasy football. George Pickens, Rachaad White, Travis Etienne, Anthony Richardson, both Calvin Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins, Zack Moss. Please smash that like button, leave a comment, head over to southharmonff.com, use that warp tool to dominate your fantasy leagues, and I will see you next time. Peace.